The howling wind tore across the Nebraska prairie like the screams of 1,000 banshees driving snow horizontally against the small log cabin that Sarah McKenna called home. She pressed her face to the frost-covered window, watching the white fury obliterate everything beyond 20 feet from her door. In her 34 years, she had weathered many harsh winters on the frontier, but this blizzard of February 1887 possessed a malevolent intensity that made her bones ache with dread. Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the meager fire crackling in her stone hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings of her one-room cabin, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with her late husband's medical books and her collection of herbs and remedies. James had been gone 3 years now, taken by consumption, leaving her alone with 40 acres of stubborn prairie soil and a loneliness that sometimes felt deeper than the winter cold. The wind suddenly shifted, and through its roar came a sound that didn't belong, a low, almost human moan from somewhere near the barn. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to the coffee pot. Wild animals seeking shelter would make such a noise, and no sensible person would be traveling in this weather. She strained to listen, but the storm swallowed all other sounds. Minutes passed. Then she heard again, definitely human, weak and desperate. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her heavy coat from its peg and wrapped a thick scarf around her head. She took the lantern from the table, checked that it held enough oil, and stepped into the Arctic hell outside her door. The wind struck her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her backward. Snow stung her exposed cheeks like needles, and she could barely keep her eyes open long enough to see her own feet. Fighting against the gale, Sarah followed the rope she'd strung between her cabin and barn earlier that winter, a lifeline that had saved her from getting lost in previous storms. The barn loomed out of the white darkness like a ghost ship, its outline barely visible even at arm's length. She fumbled with the heavy wooden bar across the door, her fingers already growing numb despite her thick mittens. Inside the barn, her 3 horses whinnied nervously in their stalls, sensing something amiss. Sarah raised her lantern high, its golden light pushing back the shadows. At first she saw nothing unusual: hay bales, farming tools, feed stacks. Then in the far corner near the back wall, she spotted a dark shape crumpled against a pile of old blankets. Her heart lurched. It was a person, a young person, she realized as she hurried closer. A boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, unconscious and covered in snow that had blown through gaps in the barn's weathered boards. His lips were blue-black with cold, his breathing shallow and labored. But what stopped Sarah's breath entirely was his appearance. The boy was clearly Lakota, with long black hair braided with leather strips and clothing that marked him as one of the hostiles that had been the subject of fearful whispers throughout Cedar Ridge for months. For a heartbeat, Sarah hesitated. The tensions between white settlers and Native Americans in the region had reached a boiling point. Just last month, the cavalry had ridden through town with grim warnings about Lakota war parties seen moving south from the Pine Ridge Reservation. Her neighbors would call her a fool or worse for harboring an Indian boy. But as she knelt beside the unconscious child and saw his chest barely rising and falling, her medical training overwhelmed her fear. This wasn't a warrior or a threat. This was a dying boy who couldn't be more than a year or 2 older than her own son would have been had he lived past infancy. Sarah set down the lantern and pressed her ear to the boy's chest. His heartbeat was weak and irregular, his skin gray with hypothermia. Worse, she could hear the wet rattle in his lungs that meant pneumonia was already setting in. Without immediate treatment, he would be dead by morning. Well, she whispered to herself, her breath forming white clouds in the cold air, I didn't become a nurse to let children die on my watch. Sarah worked quickly, wrapping the boy in every blanket she could find in the barn before half-carrying, half-dragging his limp form through the storm to her cabin. The journey that normally took 30 seconds stretched into an eternity of fighting wind and snow while supporting his weight. By the time she got him inside, both of them were covered in ice and snow, and Sarah's strength was nearly spent. She laid him on her bed and immediately began stripping away his wet clothes, replacing them with her warmest flannel nightgown, one of James's that she kept. The boy's feet were white with frostbite, and his hands were so cold they felt like marble. Sarah knew she had hours of desperate work ahead of her if she wanted to save his life. As she prepared hot water bottles and mixed the herbal remedies that might fight the infection growing in his lungs, Sarah found herself wondering who this boy was and how he'd come to be alone in such a deadly storm. But those questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was keeping death from claiming another young life in her presence. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of battle had begun. For 3 days and nights, Sarah barely left the boy's side. She fought his fever with cool cloths and willow bark tea, forced warm broth between his cracked lips, and massaged his frostbitten fingers and toes back to life. On the fourth morning, when his eyes finally fluttered open and focused on her face, she nearly wept with relief. The boy's dark eyes were filled with confusion and wariness as he took in his surroundings, the unfamiliar cabin, the white woman hovering over him, the scent of unfamiliar herbs. He tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows, his body still weak from his ordeal. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Easy now," she said softly. "You're safe. You've been very sick." The boy stared at her for a long moment, processing her words. Then, in careful, halting English, he whispered, "You help me." Sarah nodded. "My name is Sarah. What's yours?" "Tokala," he replied, his voice barely audible. Then, touching his chest, he added what sounded like a longer name in his own language. Over the following days, as Tokala's strength slowly returned, Sarah learned fragments of his story. He had been on a hunting expedition with his older brother and uncle when the blizzard struck without warning. In the whiteout conditions, he had become separated from the others and wandered for hours before collapsing near a barn. His family would be searching for him, he told her with growing distress, but they would never think to look on a white settler's land. Despite her initial fears about harboring a Lakota boy, Sarah found herself growing fond of her unexpected guest. Tokala was intelligent and curious, with a quick smile that reminded her painfully of the children she had lost. As he recovered, he began helping with small chores around the cabin, carrying in firewood, feeding the chickens, mending a broken chair leg with surprising skill. In the evenings, as they sat by the fire, Tokala began teaching Sarah words in Lakota while she helped him practice his English. She learned that his name meant fox, chosen because of his cleverness and ability to find his way through difficult terrain, an irony not lost on either of them given how he ended up at her door. He taught her to say Minikai Oyasin, all my relations, explaining that it meant everything in the world was connected. Sarah shared stories of her life with James, how they had come west with dreams of building something together, and how those dreams had crumbled with his death. She found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, perhaps because Tokala listened without judgment, or perhaps because their communication required such simplicity that only the essential truths could pass between them. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Tokala was strong enough to walk to the barn and back without tiring. Sarah knew it was time to discuss his return to his people, but she dreaded the conversation. The boy had brought unexpected warmth and purpose to her lonely existence. For the first time since James' death, she looked forward to waking each morning. One evening, as they prepared their simple supper, Tokala suddenly stopped stirring the pot of stew and looked at her with serious eyes. "Sarah," he said carefully, "my people, they think I am dead?" She nodded slowly. "Probably. It's been almost a month." Tokala was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "You are lonely here, like me when storm came." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The boy saw more than she had realized. "Yes," she admitted. "Very lonely." "My grandmother," Tokala continued, struggling with the English words she say, "loneliness is like winter that never ends. But kindness," he gestured between them, "kindness makes spring come." That night, as Sarah listened to Tokala's steady breathing from his makeshift bed near the fire, she realized that saving his life had somehow begun to save her own. But she also knew that keeping him would be wrong, for both of them. His family needed to know that he was alive and he belonged with his people. The question was, how could she safely get home without endangering them both? Spring arrived early that year, melting the last of the snow by mid-March and turning the prairie into a sea of mud and new grass. With the warming weather came a restlessness in Tokala that Sarah could no longer ignore. She would catch him standing at the window, staring toward the northern horizon where his people lived, his young face etched with longing. The solution came from an unexpected source. Ezra Hutchins, a grizzled fur trader who had been working the frontier for 30 years, stopped at Sarah's homestead during one of his regular trading circuits. Sarah had known Ezra since her early days in Nebraska. He was one of the few white men who had earned the trust of various native tribes through fair dealing and respect for their customs. When Sarah cautiously broached the subject of a lost Lakota boy, Ezra's weathered face broke into a knowing grin. "Figured there was more to your story than you were letting on," he said, settling back in his chair with a cup of Sarah's coffee. "Whole territory's been buzzing about Chief Red Hawk's missing nephew. Boy named Tokala means fox, don't it?" Sarah's heart leaped. His uncle is a chief, and a respected one. Red Hawk's been leading search parties since the blizzard ended, but they've been looking north and east, figuring the boy got turned around in the storm. Ezra studied Sarah's face carefully. "This nephew of his, he wouldn't happen to be recovering from frostbite and pneumonia in your back room, would he?" When Sarah brought Tokala out to meet Ezra, the old trader's eyes lit up with recognition. He spoke a few words in Lakota, and Tokala responded eagerly, his face animated with hope for the first time in weeks. "He says you saved his life," Ezra translated. "Says your ton went waste. A good-hearted woman. That's high praise from the Lakota. Over the next hour, Ezra explained the situation to both Sarah and Tokala. Red Hawk's band was currently camped along the Niobrara River, about 40 miles north. The chief had been preparing to hold a mourning ceremony for his nephew, convinced the boy had perished in the storm. Ezra could take Tokala to them safely. His trading relationship with the tribe guaranteed safe passage. That evening, as Sarah and Tokala prepared for what they both knew would be their last night together, the weight of their impending separation hung heavy in the small cabin. Sarah had grown accustomed to Tokala's quiet presence, his help with daily chores, and their evening conversations by the fire. He had filled a void in her life she hadn't fully realized existed. "I will miss you, Sarah Tunwin," Tokala said softly, using the Lakota word for woman that he had taught her. "You give me life. You give me," he struggled for the English word, then placed his hand over his heart, "hope." Sarah felt tears threatening. "I'll miss you too, Foxboy, more than you know." Tokala was quiet for a moment, then reached into the small bundle of his belongings that Sarah had carefully preserved. He pulled out a small carved wooden fox, no bigger than her thumb, its surface smooth from years of handling. "My grandfather make this," he said, pressing it into her palm. "He say fox spirit protect those who show kindness to strangers. You keep, remember Tokala." Sarah closed her fingers around the small carving, feeling its warmth. "I have something for you too." She went to her trunk and retrieved a small leather-bound journal, one of James' medical books that contained detailed drawings of medicinal plants. "Your English is getting so good. This will help you learn more." They sat by the fire late into the night, with Tokala teaching Sarah a traditional Lakota song about the renewal that comes with spring and Sarah showing him how to write his name in English letters. It felt like a ceremony of sorts, a formal acknowledgement of the bond they had forged and the growth they had both experienced. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a warmth that promised the harsh winter was truly over. Ezra arrived at sunrise with an extra horse ready for the journey north. As Tokala gathered his few belongings, Sarah packed a bundle of food for the trip and included some of her dried herbs, a gift for his family's medicine woman. Standing beside Ezra's wagon, Tokala seemed suddenly young again, nervous about facing a family that had given him up for dead. Sarah knelt down to his level and placed her hands on his shoulders. "You're going home, Tokala. Your uncle will be so happy to see you alive." She smiled, though her heart was breaking. "And you'll tell them about the white woman who believes all people are connected, just as your grandfather taught you." Tokala nodded solemnly, then surprised her by wrapping his arms around her in a fierce hug. "Minikai Oyasin," he whispered. "All my relations." "All my relations," Sarah repeated, the Lakota words feeling natural on her tongue. As Ezra's wagon disappeared over the northern hill, Sarah stood in her doorway holding the wooden fox carving, watching until they were just a speck on the horizon. The cabin felt impossibly empty behind her, but for the first time since James' death, the silence didn't feel like defeat. She had saved a life, and in doing so, had remembered what it meant to truly live. Whatever happened next, she would carry that knowledge forward like a flame against the darkness. Summer stretched long and quiet ahead of her, but Sarah McKenna no longer feared the solitude. She could learn that even the briefest connections could change everything, and that kindness, once given freely, had a way of returning when least expected. The months that followed Tokala's departure settled into a rhythm that Sarah had never quite experienced before. Though alone, she no longer felt abandoned by life. She tended her garden with renewed purpose, expanded her herb collection, and even began trading her medicinal remedies with neighboring homesteaders. The wooden fox carving sat prominently on her mantelpiece, a daily reminder that she had made a difference in the world. By late September, the prairie had transformed into a tapestry of gold and amber. Sarah was harvesting the last of her vegetables when she noticed her chickens acting strangely, clustered together and making agitated sounds. Her horses, too, seemed restless in their pasture, ears pricked forward as they stared toward the northern horizon. At first, Sarah attributed their behavior to an approaching weather change. But as she straightened from pulling carrots, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A dust cloud was rising in the distance, too large and organized to be wild animals, too purposeful to be a random group of travelers. As the cloud drew nearer, Sarah could make out individual riders, dozens of them, moving in formation across the prairie directly toward her homestead. Her first instinct was fear. Raiding parties were still a real threat in the territory, and a lone woman would be defenseless against such numbers. She considered running to the cabin for James' old rifle, but something about the measured pace of the approaching riders stayed her hand. This didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a procession. As the group crested the final hill before her property, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Leading the procession was a magnificent painted horse carrying a tall man in elaborate ceremonial dress, feathered headdress, beaded buckskin, and a bearing that spoke of natural authority. Beside him rode a smaller figure on a familiar bay horse, and even at a distance, Sarah recognized the easy seat and confident posture. "Tokala," she whispered, her hand flying to her heart. The boy had grown taller in the months since their parting, his shoulders broader, his face more mature. But when he spotted her standing in the garden, his composed demeanor broke into the radiant smile she remembered so well. He urged his horse forward, calling out her name in a voice cracking with excitement. Behind Tokala and the imposing chief, who could only be Red Hawk, came a cavalcade unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Men, women, and children, some mounted, others walking alongside travois laden with bundles and mysterious packages. Elderly people wrapped in colorful blankets, young warriors with painted faces, mothers carrying babies, children running alongside the horses. The entire procession moved with ceremonial dignity, like a river of people flowing across the prairie toward her small homestead. As they drew closer, Sarah could see that many of the bundles on the travois were beautifully crafted items, blankets with intricate beadwork, decorated pottery, carved wooden objects that gleamed in the afternoon sun. This wasn't a raiding party or even a casual visit. This was something far more significant. Tokala reached her first, sliding down from his horse with fluid grace and running the last few steps to where she stood frozen in amazement. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in the same fierce embrace they had shared at their parting, though now he was tall enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "Sarah Tunwin," he said, his English noticeably improved. "We have come. All of us have come." "But why?" Sarah asked, bewildered by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. "Tokala, there must be 50 people here." Before the boy could answer, Chief Red Hawk approached on foot, having dismounted from his horse with dignified ceremony. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair braided with silver ornaments and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. But when he looked at Sarah, those penetrating eyes were warm with unmistakable gratitude. Tokala quickly moved to stand between them, clearly intending to translate. But to Sarah's surprise, Red Hawk spoke directly to her in careful, accented English. "Sarah McKenna," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard so that everyone could hear. "I am Red Hawk, uncle to this boy whose life you saved. We have traveled far to find you." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the formality of the moment and the weight of so many eyes upon her. "Chief Red Hawk, I have only did what anyone would have done. Tokala was hurt, and I helped him heal. That's all." Red Hawk's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "That is not all, and you know this. Tokala has told us of your kindness, of the warmth you showed to a stranger, of the risks you took to save a child not your own." He gestured toward the assembled people. "His people, my people. We have come to honor this deed." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, men and women of all ages, children peeking shyly from behind their parents, elderly people wrapped in magnificent robes. All of them had traveled here to her small homestead in the middle of nowhere because she had brought one lost boy in from a blizzard. "You came all this way just to thank me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We came," said Red Hawk solemnly, "to show you what gratitude looks like when it comes from the heart of a people." As if his words were a signal, the assembled crowd began to move with practiced precision. The travois were unpacked, bundles were unwrapped, and suddenly Sarah's modest yard was transformed into something magical. A temporary village centered around celebration and ceremony. Cook fires were lit, colorful blankets were spread on the ground, and the evening air filled with the sounds of preparation and anticipation. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still holding Tokala's hand, overwhelmed by the realization that her simple act of mercy had somehow grown into something far larger than she could have imagined. These people, an entire community, had come not just to thank her, but to claim her as one of their own. The ceremony of gratitude was about to begin. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie sky in shades of amber and rose, the Lakota camp around Sarah's homestead took on an almost otherworldly beauty. Cook fires cast dancing shadows across painted faces, and the evening air filled with the haunting melody of wooden flutes and the rhythmic beating of drums. Sarah had been gently led to a place of honor on a beautifully woven blanket at the center of the gathering. She sat cross-legged, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding around her. Tokala remained close by, serving as both translator and reassuring presence, though his English had improved so dramatically that translation was rarely needed. Chief Red Hawk stood before the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air as he spoke first in Lakota, then in English for Sarah's benefit. "We gather tonight under the same stars that watched over our nephew when he lay dying in the white woman's care," he began. "We gather to witness something that happens rarely in this world, a deed so pure in its intention that it creates bonds stronger than blood, bridges wider than the differences between peoples. An elderly woman whom Tokala whispered was the tribe's most respected medicine woman approached carrying a wooden bowl that seemed to smoke with burning sage. She circled Sarah 3 times, wafting the aromatic smoke around her while chanting in a voice weathered by decades of ceremony. Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her as the sage smoke enveloped her. "Grandmother White Dove says you have a healer's spirit," Tokala translated softly. "She can see it in your aura." What followed was a procession of gifts that left Sarah speechless. Warriors approached with their finest horses, strong, beautiful animals with painted markings and decorated bridles. Women presented blankets of such exquisite craftsmanship that Sarah gasped at their beauty, each one telling a story through intricate beadwork and symbolic patterns. A young mother placed a pair of delicately beaded moccasins at Sarah's feet, explaining through Tokala that they were made to carry her on good paths throughout her life. Children brought carved wooden animals, pottery decorated with meaningful symbols, and strings of polished stones that caught the firelight like captured stars. But perhaps most moving were the gifts of food. Parfleche containers filled with pemmican that would last through the hardest winters, dried berries and herbs gathered from sacred places, and beautifully painted gourds containing seeds for plants that didn't grow wild on the Nebraska prairie. "These are not just gifts," Red Hawk explained as the presentation continued. "Each item carries the gratitude of the giver and the promise of continued connection. You will never be alone as long as these things surround you." When the gift-giving concluded, Red Hawk called for silence. The drums quieted, conversation ceased, and even the children seemed to sense the solemnity of what was about to occur. The chief approached Sarah with something wrapped in white doeskin, his movements formal and deliberate. "Sarah McKenna," he said, his voice resonating with ceremonial authority, "you saved not just one boy's life, but the future of our bloodline. Tokala is my sister's son, destined to be a leader among our people. Without your intervention, that future would have died in the snow." He unwrapped the doeskin to reveal a magnificent necklace, a choker of white and blue beads with a central medallion featuring intricate quillwork in the shape of a fox surrounded by healing symbols. "This belonged to my grandmother, who was known throughout the territory for her medicine work and her ability to see the good in all people," Red Hawk continued. "It is said that whoever wears it will always know how to heal what is broken, whether in body or spirit." As he placed the necklace around Sarah's neck, his voice took on an even more formal tone. "By the power invested in me as chief of this band, and by the unanimous consent of our council of elders, I name you Wikapi Waste. Good star, for you appeared in our darkest hour like a guiding light." The crowd erupted in celebration, drums pounding, voices raised in joyful songs, children dancing around the fires. But Red Hawk wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he announced, raising his hand for quiet, "we claim you as Hunka, adopted sister to our people. Your blood may not be Lakota, but your heart beats with the rhythm of our values. You're welcome in our lodges, at our fires, and in our ceremonies for as long as you draw breath." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of what was happening settled over her. These people, this entire community, had not only traveled hundreds of miles to thank her, but were formally welcoming her into their family. Tokala leaned close and whispered, "Now you will never be lonely again, Sarah Tunwin. You have relatives wherever the Lakota people go." The ceremony continued late into the night with storytelling, traditional dances, and the sharing of food around the communal fires. Sarah learned that several families had actually moved their fall hunting camps closer to her area so they could visit regularly and ensure she had everything she needed for the coming winter. As the celebration finally began to wind down and people prepared to rest before the journey home, Red Hawk approached Sarah one final time. "The boy tells me you lost your husband and that you have no children of your own," he said gently. "This grieves us, for we believe every person should have family to care for them. Know that from this day forward, you have many sons and daughters, grandparents and cousins. You are no longer a woman alone on the prairie. You are Wikapi Waste of the Lakota people." When Sarah woke the next morning, she emerged from her cabin to find the temporary village already being packed away with the same efficient ceremony with which it had been erected. But the gifts remained. Her yard was filled with beautiful blankets, painted pottery, and enough food to last through the winter. As the procession prepared to depart, Tokala rode up to her one last time. He was no longer the frightened, half-frozen boy she had found in her barn, but a confident young man taking his place in his community. "I will see you again, Wikapi Waste," he said, using her new name with obvious pride. "When the snows melt, I will come to help with your spring planting. And when you are old, there will be Lakota grandchildren to bring you firewood and listen to your stories." Sarah reached up to touch the sacred necklace at her throat, feeling its weight like a tangible reminder of the connections that now bound her to something larger than herself. "Midakai Oyasin," she said, the Lakota words flowing naturally from her lips. "All my relations," Tokala replied with a brilliant smile. As the last riders disappeared over the northern hill, Sarah stood in her doorway surrounded by the physical evidence of a community's gratitude. Her small homestead had been transformed, but more importantly, so had she. She was no longer Sarah McKenna, the lonely widow scratching out an existence on the frontier. She was Wigapi Waste, Good Star, and she belonged to a people who understood that true wealth was measured not in land or gold, but in the connections forged between hearts willing to see past differences to the shared humanity beneath. The prairie wind carried the sound of distant singing back to her ears, and Sarah smiled as she began to plan for the next winter. This time, she would be ready not just to survive it, but to welcome anyone who might need shelter from the storm.